welcome. My name is Adam Day. I'm the Director of Programs at UN University's Center for Policy Research. And I have to start by saying that we are recording this session and we will send you a copy if you're signed up. So welcome. As people filter in, and just before we get started with the program itself, I wanted to just offer a thought about why I think it's important to be talking about authoritarianism today in the midst of a global pandemic. And really the pandemic response has generated a massive and unprecedented outpouring of resources, a tectonic shift in the scale of aid delivery and spending around the world. And at these moments of large scale resource mobilization, there are heightened risks of capture and manipulation. Some organizations are already reporting rises in different forms of corruption and misuse of pandemic responses. And there are a lot of reports suggesting that authoritarianism might be bolstered through this. And I think this prompts a broader question: will a small group of elites be the ultimate beneficiaries of major resource flows, or will we find a way to use this moment to engineer a different distribution of power and resources? And that kind of question is really at the heart of this project on peacebuilding and authoritarianism. And even though today we're talking about a specific set of activities around peacebuilding, we hope that today's conversation will also prompt a deeper questioning about how systems of governance we have in place today at global and national levels have developed strong gravitational pulls to the center, often to the direct detriment of broader populations. And we really have a wonderful group to speak to those issues today. And I'll briefly introduce them at the outset, and then we'll get right into the program. So we have Alice Jacobs, who's the Deputy Political Coordinator representing the UK, our generous donor, which is really a country grappling with big global systemic questions, whether it's COP26, the new post-Brexit strategy, but really the UK is a thought leader in many of these issues, also around conflict resolution and peace building. We're really lucky to have Oscar Fernandez Tiranco, who's the Assistant Secretary General and the head of the UN's Peacebuilding Support Office, which is the entity in the UN most focused on addressing those deeper, longer-term issues of inclusion, equality, resilience, and especially in terms of sustaining peace and preventing future conflicts. I'm very lucky to be joined by Allegra Baiocchi, who's calling in from Costa Rica, who also served as the UN's resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Cameroon, a country where many of the trends that we're looking at in this project have really come on stark display. And she's also held leadership positions in the UN in other countries we examined, Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC. And we're hoping that can talk about how she's grappled with many of these questions in real time. And we're also joined by Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and one really on the forefront of thinkers examining how political decisions might set us on the path towards authoritarianism in a range of settings. Her book, A Savage Order, is, in my view, one of the most important contributions to the discussion we're having today. You're already online, go buy it now. And so really just a thank you to all of you who are joining. We'll first hear some brief introductory remarks from Alice, followed by a short overview of the main findings of the report by myself and my co-authors who are here today, Sarah von Billerbeck, Oisin Tanzi, and Iham Al-Maleh. And then we'll get into the reactions by this panel and into a discussion with all of you. And I encourage you to use the Q&A to jot the questions down as we go. If you'd like to speak, you can say you'd like to speak in the Q&A and we'll turn you into a participant, but really want to move directly into this. And so Alice, without further ado, really a thanks to you also for joining during this condolence period for the Duke of Edinburgh. I know this has inhibited some other activities, so a real appreciation for you joining us today. Alice, please, over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for those kind words. And welcome, everybody. It's great to see so much interest in this report, and I'm grateful for the Centre for Policy Research for bringing us together. So the United Kingdom's interest in supporting this research is very simple. We have seen too many instances in which peace building has not been enough to deliver the kind of durable, inclusive peace that I think most of us here want to see. That's not to say that peace building is a wasted investment. On the contrary, we believe that well-designed peace building approaches provide the best hope for preventing lapse or relapse into conflict. And I should say that we've also seen plenty of examples of UN peace building success, including in many of the nationally owned peace building projects supported by the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. But getting peacebuilding support right is still a challenge, as I'm sure ASG Fernandez Tiranco would be the first to recognize. We mustn't be afraid of continually evaluating, critiquing, and improving our approaches. And that's why the recent review of the UN peacebuilding architecture was so important. As the UK, we recognise the fundamental importance of development and economic growth for countries' stability and prosperity. And we invest heavily in supporting countries to this end. But we also believe, and the evidence supports this, that open and inclusive societies are the most resilient to shocks that can undermine this stability and prosperity. So for us, it is critical that peacebuilding support and development assistance more broadly is deployed in a manner that does not end up reinforcing systems that favour only a small elite, and in doing so jeopardise the legitimate aspirations of the whole of society. Peace and development should go hand in hand, and we believe this means being careful not inadvertently to erode systems and institutions that provide for civil, political, economic, and social inclusion, access to justice and protection, and respect for human rights and the rule of law. Understanding the risks is critical to getting peacebuilding right. It is our hope that in reflecting on these risks, this research will help donors and the UN system ensure that our programming and our broader political engagement supports rather than undermines peace and development. Looking at the report itself, I read the 3 case studies with great interest, which have provided useful food for thought for our desk officers here in the mission, and also in London and our embassies and high commissions on the ground. And I also thought that the framework for peace builders in chapter 3 of the report provides a particularly helpful resource for policymakers and practitioners. And as one myself, I always find that academic research is at its best when it has practical purpose and leads to applicable and actionable recommendations grounded in the reality of work in the field. And I think it's something you, Adam, and your team do so well, and it's also why the UK has supported this publication. With that said, I just want to thank Adam, Sarah, Basheen, and Ian for all the work that has gone into this, and a special thanks to Oscar, Allegra, and Rachel for joining as respondents today. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and crucially to thinking through with all of you how we can take this work forward to make an impact on the ground and help advance sustainable peace and development. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Alice. I don't think there's any greater praise for someone in my business than the phrase practical purpose. So thank you for that. And for your support to this project. Really, just for the next few minutes, Sarah, Oshin, and Iham and I are going to give you the highlights from our report, which you can all read. We'll put a link to it in case you haven't gotten that. Our main goal is to get as quickly as possible to our speakers and move into a discussion with all of you about the questions that this project has prompted. And really, to start, this project was driven by the question, how might peace building enable authoritarian tendencies in different settings? How do the activities of peace building, from quite technical things like capacity building to more overtly political engagement, like advice to a country's leadership or public messaging, how might those embolden national leaders to further centralize power, to channel resources to a small elite, or to even undermine democratic processes? And it's an intentionally provocative question because peace building is actually geared at exactly the opposite set of effects. Peace building, at least within common parlance, is about supporting inclusive, transparent transitions out of conflict, building strong democratic forms of governance. So the question that we're looking at is really the unintended consequences of peace building by the UN, but also by a wide range of international donors and development actors and international financial institutions. And it's also really about balancing difficult decisions and dilemmas without clear answers. Sometimes peace builders are confronted with settings where a very small elite in power is actually the most effective partner for achieving progress. And I remember dealing with this issue when I was working in Kabila's Democratic Republic of Congo in 2016, where a small elite was really what we saw as one of the key actors in getting many of the programs done. But then the question is, what is the trade-off between supporting that elite to accomplish something important, like an election or a project, versus the risk that that support might be captured or distorted, creating inequalities, maybe further marginalizing large populations. This project is really about how we all grapple with those questions, especially the question of short-term gains versus long-term risks associated with authoritarianism.
So our team looked at two ways in which the activities of peacebuilding can bolster authoritarianism. And the first is informational signaling mechanism, and the second is about material support. So the first way peacebuilding can embolden authoritarian tendencies is through signaling. And this can include weak enforcement of democratic norms or weak conditionality or simply inaction in the face of authoritarian behavior. You know, peacebuilders have a range of obligations. They need to maintain stability, they need to prevent the outbreak of violence, they need to maintain consent to being there, access, good working relationships with the government, they need to demonstrate concrete outputs. You know, so when they encounter authoritarian behavior, they need to consider how a robust response might imperil those other equally worthy objectives. And if they determine that the risk to those other goals is too high, they may respond mildly or behave in a conciliatory way, emphasizing dialogue or, you know, working together rhetorically, but without any real sanction of bad behavior. But of course, doing that sends a signal that the political cost of authoritarian moves by the regime is low, and that the UN will continue to work with and support a government even in the face of serious human rights abuses or repression or fraud, which can then in turn further embolden authoritarian tendencies. So here we looked at a range of cases, including 1990s Cambodia, Haiti over several decades, and DRC. And in all of them, we found some evidence that the signaling by the international community played a role in bolstering authoritarian tendencies.
And we also looked then at a second form of influence relating to the material support that is given to host states during peacebuilding. And in a way, material support is often the kind of the overt or overriding goal of peacebuilding. The UN and international actors, they want to and are often focused on building up the capacity of the state, providing resources for elections, strengthening state institutions so that they have just the ability and the capacity and independence to deal with the aftermath of conflict. And this support can really play a crucial role in reducing the risk of relapse into conflict. But there's also this risk that it can bolster a particular elite or a particular authoritarian government in power and allow that government to concentrate power at the expense of either at the expense of citizens or at the expense of other pockets of countervailing power within the political system. So for example, in our DRC study, we examined how the kind of significant levels of support over many years that the UN and partners provided to the Kabila government helped him in many ways that were not entirely compatible with the kind of the stated aims of peacebuilding. They helped Kabila to consolidate power, to marginalize certain political opposition groups, and to fund a range of activities that actually worked against some of the key goals of promoting an inclusive, equitable form of democracy within the country. And on that point about funding, over to Iham, who will talk more on the funding issues.
Yeah, so trying to operationalize this question of offering material support to the government, we examined nine other country settings where the UN and international donors have invested heavily in peacebuilding support in dollar-wise. We looked at cases that where the peacebuilding support constituted a relatively large proportion of the overall aid footprint in the country. And we used the previous work done by the Peacebuilding Support Office to track OECD aid flows that were tracked by OECD to figure out if there was a difference, or we could discern a difference between different areas of peacebuilding and development assistance, and know whether funding to one area might that increases state capacity or versus in funding to other areas that facilitate more broad-based support, if there's a difference between those two kinds of settings. So it allowed us to compare these two kinds of settings and ask the question if there is a difference between the resources that the government receives directly from donors, or it has there's a different impact of peacebuilding when the resources are received by local NGOs or civil society or UN entities. So, so one of our most striking findings, and I'm not sure if I can't see the slide up, but there should be a slide. Yes, thank you so much, James. So one of our most striking findings, of course, is that the peace-building support that goes towards core government functions, so public financial management, public policy, administrative management, etc., goes largely towards recipient governments. So that was like one category of countries where that was a large footprint. Another category of countries was where funding was going mostly towards safety and security, human rights, and rule of law, inclusive political processes, in which the government is not actually the first recipient of funding. What we found was actually in the countries that where they had received a lot of funding towards core government functions, they don't see necessarily a very strong improvement, actually quite a negative developments in their governance indicators over a 10-year period. Now, this is not to say that we're drawing any causal links or anything, but it does highlight the importance of how peace-building support is being developed, whether it's something that we do to shore up the central executive through budget support operations, or it's something that peacebuilding is something that you do to drive more broad-based political participation. There's a major question that has implications for the types of consequences that we have for peacebuilding.
Thanks, Iham. And really this comparison across a dozen cases in terms of where the money's flowing, where the resources end up, allowed us to make some broad findings about how peacebuilding might enable authoritarian tendencies. We're not going to list them all, you've got the report, but we wanted to give you just a few to tee up the discussion and the panelists. And the first one is really, even where peacebuilding programming is overtly geared at inclusive political processes, there is still a strong tendency for resources and political support to align behind and be channeled to a small elite within the state. In our report, we call this the gravitational pull of the state. There are exceptions to this, and in fact, a lot of the UN work that we've looked at has demonstrated less of this tendency than many other international donors, and some of the best practices come out of the UN. But overall, that gravitational pull of the state remains extremely strong in peacebuilding.
The second point here is we found that 3 factors often contributed to authoritarian tendency. So first of these is the focus. There tends to be a focus on the executive and on supporting the head of state, who's often seen as a key interlocutor for the UN. And while that in itself is not inherently authoritarian or doesn't inherently promote authoritarianism, it often does come at the expense of support to other institutions of the state that might be more likely to be inclusive, like parliaments, for example. Second, support to security services, especially in peacekeeping settings, often allowed for elites to consolidate power, not surprisingly. And third and finally, efforts to prevent overthrow or coup attempts and the instability that would of course occur in the aftermath of something like that, again, fairly intuitively resulted in greater concentrations of power and resources in the center.
And this points to what we call the dark side of national ownership in our report, which is one of the most common mantras in peacebuilding is that national ownership, helping build political will and buy into peacebuilding goals. We found many examples of good practice here, but we also found instances where the UN and others had signaled it to isolated or repressive regimes that they could continue restricting political space with relative impunity and without facing serious repercussions from the international community. Burundi's 2015 electoral crisis was one moment we highlighted in this context, but that idea that national ownership has kind of 2 sides of a coin was very important. We had several other findings, including around the mandates that the Security Council offers, electoral support, the role of corruption, public messaging, all of which raise difficult dilemmas in how to balance international peacebuilding support between short-term goals and longer-term risks. One of our most important findings across our cases was that the UN often did a better job of avoiding these common pitfalls than other international actors, by focusing more of its resources towards inclusive political processes in that diagram that Iham showed you, human rights and other activities, rather than exclusively shoring up the central executive through budgetary support. One example of that was in Somalia, which is one of the countries with the highest risks of corruption and centralization. The international community has really hedged against some of those risks by channeling much of its support through the UN agencies, making the UN more of an important actor and maybe counteracting some of that gravitational pull of the state. It's not always the case, and we do point to some of the good practices the UN is developing to mitigate some of those other risks. So we conclude our report with this framework that Alice mentioned for peace builders to help navigate some of these difficult questions. And much of this framework centers on better tracking of resources, conditioning support more on clear progress towards inclusion, especially of women, building a strategy that has some teeth and leverage in terms of actually pushing back in moments of repressive tactics, and providing more support to UN leaders in the field so they don't have to tackle these dilemmas alone with some of the risks that they have with them. Rather than go into these in detail, we're really hoping to hear from our panel of speakers to get their reactions to the report, to get how they've dealt with some of these dilemmas, and to generate a discussion with all of you about the questions it raises for peace building. So without speaking anymore, I'd really like to welcome Oscar Fernandez Tiranco to speak. And Oscar, as the head of the UN's Peacebuilding Support Office, we know that you grapple with these questions every day, and we'd really like to hear about how you've worked at that very high level to get that balance between support to countries emerging from conflict and also promoting more inclusive forms of government. Thank you also to your team for the support it's provided to this project throughout. Over to you, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Adam. And let me start by congratulating you and the UNU team really for stimulating and provocative research. I'm also very honored to be a panelist together with Rachel and Allegra. So thank you for that. And I also to thank you for allowing us actually to share some of our experiences with prioritizing more inclusive forms of governance in conflict affected countries. So I am really very pleased to see that the research actually recognizes some of PBSO's core practices as an important approaches, to limiting the unintended consequences towards central government elite capture. This does not come as a major surprise, since we try to factor this into the design of many of our interventions. Inclusivity has always been really front and center of all the work that we do in PBSO. Inclusive, responsive, accountable governance is really critical to peace building. And I think this notion of the whole of society approach as a core to is really the core to this paradigm shift that happened with the 2016 resolution of the Security Council and the General Assembly on sustaining peace and peace building. And again, this very important concept that was just reaffirmed again in December of last year with a follow-up twin resolution of the Council and the General Assembly. So for us, really, inclusivity is really at the core of a lot of what is fundamental in terms of design. It's a win-win type of approach. It really does help accelerate progress to the SDGs. It is crucial to building this critical component of peace building, which is trust, building trust with and in government institutions, but also as a way to strengthen social cohesion. This means, and I think as your study implies, that national ownership has to be much more than just with the central government ownership. It should be, and I think core to a lot of the peace building successes we've seen, that many of the successful peace building initiatives are really rooted at the local level with communities. The Peace Building Fund and I think the Peace Building Commission are really excellent instruments. They have proven and put in action, if you will, this notion of inclusivity as a win-win approach. It is how we also design and collaborate across partnerships in conflict-affected countries. And it also is a key defining factor in our relationship with the World Bank. So let me very quickly set out in three key aspects on the how we can avert some of the issues that you raise of concern in your report. The Peace Building Fund actually has a successful track record of fostering meaningful participation in political processes. Particular, if we look at the fund's Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative, which focuses on including women, youth, and marginalized groups in decision-making opportunities and leadership positions. We saw how in South Sudan, for example, the fund helped ensure that the leadership by women in the country's national dialogue that was able to go from very zero participation to up to 33% by the end of last year. And again, with this targeted focus on ensuring actual participation by women in this process. What has helped us immensely, as your study highlights, was using clearly tracked targets from the start to the finish. For example, we continue to surpass our own established target, which is much higher than the UN target to begin with, of allocating at least 30% of our entire investments to supporting gender equality and women's empowerment, for which, again, we have gone beyond the 30% to now mark 40% of our overall investments over the past 3 years. And of this, much of this investment does go through UN agencies, but 40% of what goes through the UN agencies is also meant to go to support local organizations of peace builders. So again, the thematic focus of this year's Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative will be to focus on enhancing local peace building initiatives and leaders. Last year's was actually in helping promote and defend human rights defenders. We are now launching in this year to provide to provide local grants to complement UN engagement in the Sahel, the priority region of programming. So the fund has shown this comparative advantage in transnational and regionalized conflict, as well as in transition environments. These are the contexts where many times inclusive governance can be particularly challenging, because power is often very fragmented, fluid, and can involve multiple levels of government. So the fund's strategic orientation in the country becomes crucial, as it works closely with the UN resident coordinator, and many times through joint steering committees that in their composition is representative of the type of dynamics and voices that we want to hear when designing our programs. The fact that the fund's projects are also mainly implemented through the UN and civil societies organization actually helps further prevent or avert the unintended central elite capture, which your report alludes to. So, for example, in the next 4 years, the strategy of the Peacebuilding Fund has as a targeted intervention to expand partnership with civil society organizations. And we hope that at the end of this particular year, we're doing thematic reviews to see the linkages between local and national peace building and the role of local peace building organizations. The second is, for example, what I think is important to raise here is the role of the Peacebuilding Commission, which in the way that it has been changing its working methods and in the way it has been convening meetings, it has been able to act as a facilitator of collaboration between member states, local civil society organizations, the private sector, academia, and grassroots institutions. Just last year, civil society organizations represented 20% of all the briefers, and the private sector represented 7% of the briefers, which is a notable increase as compared to anything that happened before in the previous years. And important as well has been the diversity among the briefers and the partners to ensure a more inclusive approach of the Commission. This year, there have been particular focus on women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, and we've had a record number of 25 women peace builders that briefed the Commission last year alone. And the importance of this, of course, is that the Peacebuilding Commission serves as an advisory body, if you will, to the Security Council, ECOSOC, and the General Assembly. So that is an important part of the equation that I wanted to highlight. And then finally, the issue of partnerships, that supporting governments with inclusive approaches to prevention is enhanced when, for example, with the World Bank, the UN, and other relevant actors work together in strong partnership. Since the UN World Bank's joint study on pathways for peace, we have seen real convergence with the bank on the need for inclusive and participatory approaches to governance and socioeconomic grievances. These approaches are particularly critical to the bank, as the bank's funds are transmitted through central government. The bank's new prevention resilience allocation, the PRA, part of its fragility, conflict, and violence envelope, aims to apply this conflict-sensitive lens to the World Bank's country portfolio. And I am encouraged to see that the bank is increasingly using this PRA, the Prevention and Resilience Allocation, and its sister instrument, the Turnaround Allocation, to drive fiscal decentralization and reform agendas that benefit marginalized regions. For example, in Niger, it is important that the UN and other actors support and accompany these type of efforts. And as your study rightfully suggests, we should do more to leverage joint messaging with the international financial institutions, the partners, and press governments to work more inclusively. So in terms of our own takeaways from your report and looking ahead, I think first, 5 key lessons. The first is to enable adaptive programming that strengthens inclusivity. We need clear data and multi-dimensional analysis of risks. Your study suggests that mapping of how power is distributed among stakeholders is a useful tool. And from the UN side, we believe that a revamped common country analysis mechanism is a key vehicle for this type of mapping. The second is to strengthen the inclusive approaches to prevention. We must leverage the people-centered approach of the 2030 agenda by engaging governments to reduce inequalities, foster inclusion, and address conflict drivers. The third is that national and local actors and affected populations must be included in the analysis, in the program design, in the implementation, and in the monitoring and evaluation of results. The fourth is that we should deepen youth involvement in our peace-building efforts and encourage this transgenerational solidarity. And the fifth and last is we need to focus on marginalized regions by strengthening the local authorities and reducing political, social, and economic horizontal inequalities. So again, to conclude, strengthening political inclusion has been a key feature of the UN's work for decades. It is also central to the Secretary General's ambition in our common agenda, initiated in the context of the UN 75th anniversary. And we just hope that your analysis can continue to be refined and built upon with more data to feed into PBSO's own thinking and inclusive peace building. So with this, really to thank you, Adam and team, for this opportunity to react to your report. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Oscar. It was a challenge to write down all those good ideas and also be ready to go to the next speaker, but I hope we can come back to a couple of those, especially those last 5 points when we get into the discussion. And I think your idea of focusing on marginalized regions is a really interesting one, as the UN also thinks about what a regional strategy might look like in the various places it has one. I'd like to now turn to Allegra, who I've already introduced in terms of her background, but really we're very lucky to have someone who has experience in so many of the different places we've already been looking at in this project. So Allegra, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, and similar to Oscar, thank you for inviting me, but thank you for the research. I was really going to say that because I think it's the first issue. It's so important to be talking about these issues, to get the data, and to somehow, if I may say, break the silence and the taboo that does surround it. So a lot of my points will be as a UN staffer, most recently RC, but in a lot of different places and different positions. And not here to say whether this happens or not. I think it's obvious that the risk is there. I think the focus of this conversation should be, how can we manage that risk and how can we obviously minimize it, and are we enabling these kind of reflections? So I have 3 points and maybe just some extra recommendations. The first is, what is the principle framework? And I started out in the humanitarian world, and as I was saying to you, Adam, yesterday, I think people would lynch me if I said that the humanitarians tend to be more principled than some other colleagues. But what I think is true is that in the humanitarian ecosystem, there is a ton of principles and rules and guidelines that you have to follow. You come in quite formatted into, these are the humanitarian principles, this is how you apply them, workshopping dilemmas, the principle of do no harm that covers everything. And I think they're so important because they actually have a direct impact on your ability to deliver. And I haven't really seen that kind of system or framework in the peace building or development world. So I think the first issue is we still need to kind of set our principles, and which one trumps the other, because of course, as you go into a country, and your research talks about it, is it state first? Is it SDGs first? Is it we the people first? What guides us and leads us? And these are dilemmas that I think just have to, there are no easy solutions, but it starts with being open about them and really working with the leadership, whether it's the global leadership of the RCs, to really come to the best possible solution. And a lot of the times that may be a compromise. Other times it will actually have to be a saying no. And sometimes it'll have to be getting PNG'd. And that's fine. And I think we should have a way, more stomach for that, because, one person gets PNG'd, the next one comes in, and it's not the end of the world. So I think just that idea of where are our principles and how do they guide us in our day-to-day work, that would be my first point. I think the second is what is success? And we do have a lot of conversations, among peers on how we measure success. And I feel it's different also within the UN system. There is still a lot of the UN that measures success in terms of turnaround of capital, how much money comes in, how much money comes out. And I think this is what we need to be working with our leadership, is also when it comes to peace building, when do we hope to see results? Because some of these results, as you said, are very long term. We may not see them in one cooperation framework, in one RC's mandate, or in one agency's work, yet we all have to bring in concrete results. So I think the whole conversation about what is results and money, and I think you really pinpointed the issue of where does our money go? And you mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of money going around. I still see a lot of scarcity. And we know that money is not flowing equally. And though I think the term value for money has always had huge value for me, and I think it comes from DFID, but do we really give the importance that we should to our money and to our investments? And do we really make them, as connected to results as they should be? I feel that results do not always drive our investments. And I really take the point that you're trying to make on direct budget support. And yes, the UN is not the biggest actor at fault on this, not at all. But yet in many countries we see, especially bilateral actors, just pouring money in. And in some countries that may be appropriate, but I would always argue, before you take that decision, why don't you look at a corruption index and see where that country is on that list? Because afterwards, I'll wait for you a couple years down the line, crocodile tears, I haven't seen any results, and all my investments have, disappeared. Oh, what a surprise. So I think we know where countries are and how they're doing on a set of indicators: transparency, corruption, democracy. All of those exist. And why not use them as we guide our investments? And I just did want to make two examples. One is absolutely PBF now, because Oscar is here. But I think the way PBF works, which is, first of all, a pretty complicated process to submit a project or a program, and tripartite. PBF already has very clear criteria for investment. So as you start a conversation with government, there are already red lines. You already know, what goes, what will go, and what won't. And you already have a first line of defense. And we found that extremely useful when we were getting requests or pressure or priorities that we didn't think made sense to us. This ability to go back to PBF and really make it a tripartite conversation. And I think the other good example I wanted to share is the World Bank. I mean, Oscar spoke about the World Bank, the IDA refugee window, which was direct support because the money did go to government, but it also required government to have a very strong protection refugee framework. And, and the disbursements were connected to that. And I can assure you that in one of my countries, the advocacy we were used to do before the IDA money came in was completely different in terms of results. Once the UN was advocating with the World Bank by its side, and with the potential loss of millions and millions of dollars, the whole conversation really changed. So I think there are examples of how these investments can be made, but always linked to some measure of result. I think the refrain that you speak in your study, and I personally heard, what does this money get us? A seat at the table. It's an illusion of influence many times. These governments are very smart. They will give you that seat, but that does not mean they will do anything that you, think is right or your priority. So I believe we need to do a lot more scrutiny on this direct budget support. And my third point is so maybe second point was how to invest. Third point is who to invest. And I think, again, the study mentions it, Oscar mentions it. And again, PBF is a wonderful example. Civil society, women, youth, there are so many counterparts we can find in countries that we can work with, even within government. I mean, a big proponent of decentralization, working with local governments. There is no single state or single center, and I think we can always find ways and people to work with within government and outside. But I would say that it goes back to the long spectrum. We need to have a different appetite for results, seeing results, but also for investments. A lot of the investments that come in are 1-2 years. And this makes it very difficult for agencies or RCs to really think through how to rebuild or build values, human rights frameworks in a country. I was thinking Rome wasn't built in a day, but Rome wasn't lost in a day either. And some of these trends have been going on for decades. And I think it's also, when do we start intervening? And if you look at the countries in your study, most of those cases are already at the end of the spectrum of increasing fragility, loss of democratic space. So I think it's also, where do we start working and when do we start working? Last point, recommendations. First, I think, as Oscar said, I agree with all the recommendations of the study, so I really hope that they will be taken up by the UN and all the other people who are listening in institutions, because I think, as you said, studies are as good as, we actually listen and change practices. Maybe a few more. I'll restate the principle. We really, within the UN, and this is more the principles framework, there must be a place where we can really build this principle framework and really disseminate it and work it with different leadership. For those who in the UN know that every year the so-called triple hats meet and workshop a lot of these issues. But that conversation has usually only stayed with the triple hats and never really trickled down to RCs, heads of agencies, UN country teams. So I think broaden this conversation up. Absolutely, we face dilemmas. Absolutely, we face risks. It's only by talking and acknowledging that we're going to figure out how to manage them. The second point is, I think, as Oscar said, analyze it. And the study also talks about it. I think once you go into any country or any process with a strong analytical base, possibly agreed by government, with government, it already gives you, your framework of work. In Cameroon, we did a recovery and peacebuilding assessment with the World Bank and the EU and government. And so that already allowed us to come to an agreed product, which showed where are the drivers of fragility, where should we be working. And I think I was just digging through UN history, and some may remember that there's actually a policy decision called United Nations Integrated Assessment and Planning Processes. I think it still exists as a policy, and yet it's been, the CCA is one instrument, but I think the CCA still remains very kind of circumscribed to the people who are actually working in that country at that time. So I think these bigger integrated analysis and planning frameworks were a really good thing of the past that we should try and dig out and apply again. Because what we want to get to, this is my third recommendation, and Oscar knows this, is a whole of UN approach. And we've had many discussions in the executive committee, deputy executive committee on countries. How do we have a whole of UN approach? We all come in with different priorities, potentially different interests, yet we have to kind of agree who comes first, who comes second, how do we divide roles and responsibilities, and then stick to it. Once we have this whole of UN approach where we have agreed what is our principal interest or most strategic interest, and then sometimes it'll be humanitarian access, sometimes it'll be development, sometimes it'll be peace building, then we really need to all stick to it. And I think that's where the empowered RC has a huge role. And then my last 2 points is really, we definitely need more programming funds to do this. I mean, we do not actually have a lot of peace building funds. And I think peace building fund is an amazing asset, but it's not available to all. Actually, it's very restricted in who it's available to. And I believe that the pot of countries that should be considered should be enlarged, because we should be working on a prevention agenda. And so the PBF only kicks in when you're already, as I said, at the end of the spectrum. And my last point is actually Oscar's point on the Peacebuilding Commission, because I believe it has a lot more potential to be that place where countries can be discussed. We have a lot of countries that will never get to the Security Council agenda for many reasons, but yet need that conversation. And I don't really see where is the obvious place for it. And I believe that the Peacebuilding Commission, could become, a place with a broader remit, and really with a focus on prevention. And as Oscar said, the advisory group to the Security Council. But for that, I think the rules of participation in the Peacebuilding Commission also need to change. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Allegra. And I hope we can circle back to some of those recommendations and points. And I was just thinking we could have really used your wordsmithing on the report. Your concept of illusion of influence should have been in there, definitely. So thank you for that. I want to turn to Rachel Kleinfeld. And really, as I was working on this project, I kept thinking about this wonderful kind of map that you have in your Savage Order book, which shows this descent from a kind of middle income, so-called developed country down into these kind of more authoritarian forms of governance. And I think it really did, even if it's not explicit in this report, your thinking really has guided ours to a large extent. So I'd really love to hear what you think of all of this, and thank you for joining.
Well, thank you. That's quite a lot to live up to. First of all, I thank you very much for writing this study. I thought it was both terrific and very brave. It's much easier to write this kind of piece from outside and to write it from within the UN system, even within UN University. It really takes quite a lot more. It's a tough position. And I also want to thank the FCDO, both for supporting my own work and also for supporting this work. I think these are hard questions that Britain is grappling with and that are important to grapple with. I wanted to start by just acknowledging that this is hard. It's really hard because peacekeeping happens in places of chronic conflict by definition. And chronic conflict is more common in authoritarian states. It's more common in places that are political marketplace systems, to use the language of Alex de Waal and the LSE conflict research program that I'll mention a few times. Those are more transactional, turbulent systems where any input gets drawn into the elite politics. There's my privilege violence language, there's authoritarian states. I'll talk more about predatory states here to just sort of umbrella them all. But whether you're talking about a consolidated power state or a less consolidated, more transactional state, these are the places conflict happens, and these are the kinds of problems that are going to happen within those states. So the UN is almost always going to be working in places where the state has goals in the opposite direction. And it's particularly hard for the United Nations because you need to work with the state. I remember actually my very first book talk on a Savage Order was with what was then DPKO. And I sat down and had this lovely talk with DPKO, and then realized as I got to the end of the talk that I had absolutely no idea what to suggest DPKO do with this analysis, because of course they had to work with the state. And it was very embarrassing as first book talk, so I wasn't really quite prepared for it. And so I just mumbled my way through and got out as fast as I could. And then my second book talk was with this little tiny NGO that worked on rule of law in Latin America. And I had far more to say to them because they could work with civil society, they could work with these other entities. And now I know that the UN has more tools and more arms, and I think it's developed more tools, frankly, in the last few years since then. But this is particularly difficult period, and it's particularly difficult for you. And I think the core problem is that the UN feels a need to intervene because of great humanitarian need, or because the Security Council has given a requirement because of geopolitical need. The UN is required to work through the government. You can stay only if a government wants you to. And yet you're working in places where the government itself is predatory and its goals are fundamentally misaligned with the UN's stated goals of peace building. And the government wants the UN only insofar as the UN helps to bolster the regime's security. And to the extent that the UN actually brings in inclusivity and democracy, the government is threatened and no longer wants the UN. That is a very difficult problem. And let's not understate how difficult that problem is. So the UN stays and it tries to work with the government and ends up doubling down on this authoritarian order because, as you say in your paper, of the diplomatic signaling and the resources that prop up these existing governments, whatever the rhetoric and smaller amounts of aid they're using to try to change this system. So I wanted to start with recognizing 5 facts. First, and these are all facts that are in your paper, I just want to draw them out for those who haven't had the pleasure yet of reading it. So first, these states are potentially fragile, they're potentially weak, but they're also fragile and weak because the government would like them to stay fragile and weak for its own purposes. And so core budgetary support is a real problem, as Allegra was saying. And this is a fight I fought with my own government. The idea of core budgetary support is that you need to build a strong state. These states will not become strong because of core budgetary support. You have governments that are inimical to that fact. And so I think we really need to consider what we're trying to do with that core budgetary support and how it's getting used. Second point, external actors are actors. They're being used in this political marketplace to, again, use Alex and others at LSE's language. Any resource, any diplomatic input, anything that you do is going to become fodder for those inside to bolster their power or to attempt to bolster their status. And that's true of these economies and these power systems. And so anything you do, you need to be thinking about how it's reverberating within these systems. Third, the UN is creating incentives, not just responding to them. So often, particularly in the crafting of peace agreements, the UN thinks it's responding to incentives, like shaping a peace agreement along ethnic lines or adding incentives for militias or what have you. But if you dole out roles in government based on the size of the armed groupings, you're clearly giving militias a reason to build up their armed groupings. And that happens in nearly all peace moments, as you see the swelling of militias before roles in government are handed out. Or if you pour aid into fixing a predatory security sector, there's a strong incentive for that security sector to stay predatory for a very long time so that those resources keep flowing. So the UN's creation of these mixed incentive structures needs to be constantly thought. Fourth is that the elites absolutely cannot do what you're asking them to do. The elites in these systems need to maintain their power. They maintain their power through control of resources and through control of violence. And so if democracy and inclusion require decentralization of money and reducing the use of personal violence, they'll be alienating their allies and security services. They'll be leaving themselves vulnerable to coups, to their enemies. They'll lose access to major sources of status and personal finance. So they just can't go there. The stakes are too great. So finally, in terms of this broad scene setting, the elites can control the environment to affect the UN calculations, by which I mean, if the UN is saying, okay, we can lower the money because the violence has reduced, the elites can make sure the violence suddenly does not reduce so that the money goes back up or what have you. So they're manipulating the very environment you're working on. So given all this very deeply depressing situation, what can the UN do about these things? I'll address resources first, then diplomatic, and I'll do it pretty quickly. So first of all, where it's possible to affect elites, I think you can be thinking sometimes about, is it possible to offer one-off rents in exchange for long-term change? This is a little bit what happened in Liberia, which was not one of your cases, but I thought should have been one of your cases since it was one of the nice potential success stories here. I think there's a lot of conflation in your report between corruption and violence, but in my own work, I think unfortunately they sometimes function on a bit of a seesaw, not a permanent seesaw, and that the political order is upheld by corruption and violence, but in short term, corruption might go up and violence might go down within a bad political order, if you will. So if you can offer, as the UN did in Liberia in their interim peace deal, okay, we will dole out seats in government for 2 years. You can maintain interim government standing. We recognize that much money is going to be stolen in this interim, but no one within that interim government is going to be able to stand for elections after 2 years. You're incentivizing a lot of theft in the short term, but you're also incentivizing the ability to change in the longer term. So thinking about ways to move from long-term theft and consolidated power to one-off exchanges, since often in these situations, people have short time horizons. There might be the chance that elites would take that particular deal. More promising, perhaps, and more positive at least, wherever possible, create hooks for civil society. As Allegra was saying, civil society doesn't have a lot of chance to get through here, and the UN can use its good offices and its push wherever it can to be looking to build places for it. Now, all civil society is not equal, where it's possible to look for civil society that's internally democratic, that's reaching outside the capital, that has broader reach to more rural parts of the country and what have you. I think that's very important. I know there's a big push for women. I know there's a big push for children. I care about women, I am one, but I really think that we need to think a lot geographically and think a lot more about rural areas and class issues and so on that sometimes get forgotten in that gender inclusion mandate. And in building up that civil society grouping, we need to think about the fact that that's a long-term play. There's a moment when change might be possible, and it's not going to be at the moment that everything is the UN is walking in there. So you're building for the future when they might be able to break through, and you're trying to give them as many chances to plan, to learn, to build coalitions amongst each other, to sit at the same table and be resourced in order to come up with agreements that can hold for later. You know, the UN can do all that, and I know you're doing a lot of that already with the Peacebuilding Fund. With security sector money, it's particularly important to empower civil society to understand the security sector. That's an area where civil society can get kind of scared and shy away. And so making sure that you have expertise and that you have civil society actors who have transparency into the budget and into the budget of where the money is going from the UN. And finally, with security sector actors, think of training within the security sector, since it's always part of these agreements. It's rarely going to serve its purpose, the training. It's part of the political marketplace. The training is something that's used as a chit for corruption. It's something that's used as a way to get out of a bad job on the street and into a nice job where you get to sit down in an air-conditioned room. And so if you start thinking about the training that way, you can actually sometimes use it as a way of getting people off the street or getting them into the air-conditioned room or what have you. But I think the UN needs to be a little bit more aware perhaps of how its training is being used rather than the substance of its training. And then I'll just end with the diplomatic signaling part. I think this is quite hard because of the UN being stuck with needing to work with the government. And I think the UN needs more tools to act. The US government has the exact same problem, but it can have its legislature say things when the executive doesn't want to say things, or civil society can say things when the government is afraid to say things. So you need multiple arms. Because the UN has more trouble doing that, more solidarity with international actors is clearly the best way to build up a little more heft. And here your partnership with the World Bank and the IFIs is just essential. Another way to do it could be red lines. The more red lines you can have at the beginning so that your hands are bound and it's not, we decided this, but oh, Freedom House has degraded you, or Transparency International has moved this. You know, once something is in a compact and there's a clear line, then you're stuck, and that can be useful. So I think both these deep ties with other groups and red lines that bind your hands ahead of time, and 3, maximizing your international pressure by uniting internationally wherever possible. And I will end there. Thanks again for such a terrific paper.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I, again, trying to jot all of the brilliance down while also thinking about the questions that are coming in. But if my endorsement didn't encourage you to buy your Rachel's book, that should have. We have several questions coming in, and I want to let a couple of them take the floor. Salva Pedula was our first one, and he is currently in Syria, I believe, or near Syria, and he's working for the special envoy in charge of civil society support. And I do want to let him come in with his question. And then Ian Quick also had a point he wanted to make also about maybe learning from different disciplines. And then Jordan Street from Safer World had some points about maybe comparing different approaches to peace building and counterterrorism. So I'd like to let those 3 audience members make a point, and then after that there was a point on examples of women's participation in peace building that I think maybe Oscar could speak to, but I want to let those three go. James, have you managed to add them as speakers?
Yes,
oh, there you are,
James.
Salva. Go ahead, Salva.
Hi, I hope you can hear me, Adam. Thank you very much. And it's great to, I'm very excited because I've been hearing the word civil society sort of echoing in very forcefully by a number of the speakers, among which the friends and colleagues that I'm delighted to see today. I'm in charge of the civil society support room in the office of the Special Envoy for Syria and the humanitarian task force. I'm the chair of the humanitarian task force. And I mention both because I will try to link the two of them. But the CSSR is an inclusion platform that we established 4 years ago when de Mistura at the time was the special envoy. And he came and said to me, I need to be able as UN special envoy to engage and listen and, meaningfully include civil society actor from inside and outside Syria, beyond the formal parties that have been identified in the Security Council Resolution 2254. Now, interestingly, he said the platform, whatever it is that you're going to do, Salva, about this, it has to be meaningful enough that I can hear their views and understanding, and we can learn from it and incorporate it in our mediation process. But obviously it has to tread carefully because they are not a party to conflict, which is a point that we always need to bear in mind. It has to have meaningful enough not to disrupt the very difficult negotiations that have been dragging on for so long, much to our frustration, despite all our best effort collectively as UN, and all the ongoing sort of difficult sort of protection and humanitarian access crisis that we're confronted with. Now, it started 4 years ago with 17 participants based in Turkey, and today we have 1,200 Syrian men and women, ranging from white helmets to former advisor ministers to women, 23-year-old women in remote areas or hard-to-reach areas who have started local initiative for dialogue, social cohesion, and peace building. Why do I say that as a way of context? Is because I think we can do and should do so much more when it comes to peace building. Take a long-term view. Allegra said Rome was not built in a day, and I'm not repeating that because I'm also Italian. I'm saying it because it takes a longemerant, long-term view to the potential of civil society beyond the instrumental element of including them into a political process and a mediation process facilitated by the UN for the purpose of credibility and legitimacy. But because they have assets, resources, they have skills and expertise. Look at Syria, 5.5 million refugees, among them civil society, women organizations have been mushrooming. They are partners of OCHA in cross-border. They do think tank work. They want to monitor future elections. They do local dialogue work. It's just an extraordinary diversity, and I think we should have a more integrated approach to tap into that. And so for me, when it comes to civil society and peace building, we should do it before peace is regrettably too late, too long has been going on for Syria, but before a peace deal is signed. But to do that, we need to go beyond the element of political inclusion, if you like. We need to look at more systematic ways to support them for capacity building. We need to certainly make sure that beyond the fact that their views and opinions should be incorporated into any UN-led or facilitated political and mediation process, that the outcome of that process, of that mediation process, generates more space for them to act. Rachel spoke about rural areas and people who are marginalized, for example. And I can tell you that we have so many organizations that we now connect with through virtual tools. We have a dedicated civil society support room virtual platform that allows people, especially women, who are confronted with more difficulties for traveling to Geneva, for engaging with us, We as UN staff cannot travel as freely into Syria or around Syria. They don't have the same opportunities for advocacy, for engaging with the international community, for getting to know potential donors, for capacity building. So we need to look at sort of the whole range in a longer term view, not only include them in a political process at the beginning of a political process, not only listen to them, not only have them because it's important for credibility and legitimacy of any outcome of a UN mediation process, but then how can we support them afterwards in their peace building ability? I can tell you that, and sorry, I get very excited about this because I've witnessed transformational experiences of cousins and families that have been divided, who've set up organization in Turkey and Lebanon and Erbil, and were considered, of course, to be opposition leaning, and others who've remained and set up different organizations inside who haven't spoken to each other for 6 years. Yet now they're coming together because of the effort we're facilitating. They're cooperating on all sorts of initiatives, but beyond including them as a UN special political missions, we can't do much. We facilitate advocacy opportunities, we get them in touch with UN agencies, but they need more systemic support. So I think what Oscar and Allegra and Rachel in particular refer to is critical in the peace building function. Civil society, and that includes, of course, women. Half of our civil society participants, 1,200 Syrian are women, should be sort of supported from the beginning and with a longer term perspective. I think I had actually courted the World Bank as well to come and be part of the CSSR sort of donor group. It's a very small group. But of course, there are political considerations in an active conflict and a political process that come into the way. But anyway, I'm sorry if I've taken too long. It wasn't a question. It was just a response to things that echoed so profoundly for me, being passionately involved on the Syria file and with Syrian civil society, and the extraordinary power that they can have if nourished, supported in the long term.
Thanks so much,
Thank you for giving me the floor.
No, it's great to have the Syrian view. And we have some more people who wanted to ask their questions in person as well. But Oscar, there was a question about whether there were examples from the UN side of meaningful inclusion of women in peace building processes. And I did want to give you a chance because I think there probably are some very good ones. Did you want to respond to that particular question, Oscar?
No, I mean, there's a lot of examples that didn't come armed. I thought we were going to be talking about your report, but we can start talking about what PBF and the PBSO and the Commission is doing, gladly so. If there's an area where we've shown significant transformative engagement of the UN system has been precisely on the agenda of women's empowerment and equality. We've invested huge amounts of resources, up to $79 million just in the past 4 years. And half of this literally going to women's organizations and civil society through UN mechanisms. So, of course, numbers are important, but they're not the only story. And, there's a lot to talk about on the issue of the South Sudan peace process, for sure. But getting people present to these discussions, but equally, and I do take the point, of course, the meaningful and effective participation is what's crucial here. It's not just the numerics. And as a UN, unfortunately, up to recently, we were very much focused on the numerics, not on the quality and the effective and meaningful engagement of that presence at the table. But for example, I mean, it's, a concrete example can be how through directed programming, we were able to ensure that the representation of women in Guinea-Bissau's parliament jumped literally from 5 members to 30. And this, this was as a result of a concerted campaign of capacity building, of mobilization, of networking, of creating a social movement that led to the election of women to the parliament. On the one hand, so the civil society focused effort of building this type of base, but at the same time, through the mission and through other international parties to create the quotas that did get decided upon to actually create the space and the possibility for a more inclusive parliamentary structure. Another example can be the whole effort that was made in the case of Liberia, since it came up, how we focused on creating local participatory justice mechanisms actually to address sexual and gender-based violence, to actually look into the issue of land conflicts, into the issues of local mediation, very much headed by women. The Palava Huts there's been a whole study done on that particular aspect, but it was about bringing access of people in remote regions, but especially putting women as central actors in the justice system and in the mechanisms of community awareness, referring victims to support services, looking into issues of security, local security, the relationship between security forces and the population intermediated through this mechanism. So again, Colombia and the Gambia could be just a final example, because the role of women in the transitional justice processes has been fundamental. And again, this requires a dedicated decision to invest in this. This doesn't happen just because this is the demand that's coming from the particular counterparts. And the reason we're able to do this is precisely through the joint analytics to see who are the actors, the local actors that will, by empowering and bringing them into the political process, into the discussion, can actually exert the influence of how the whole transitional justice mechanism was designed. The Gambia is a case in point. The Reparations, Truth and Reconciliation Commission was very much based on huge consultations that took place across the country. Pablo de Grave was one of the ones that helped us design this whole system. And in the case of Colombia, again, to focus on the issue of victims and women and the role of young people. So, I mean, I have lots of examples that I would be more than happy to share. And these are not these are evaluations done not just by external international consultants, by the perception studies and communities themselves seeing what changed in their lives as a result of these investments. Because I think this is a crucial part of the equation, is who is being held accountable for results and how are results being perceived by those who we claim to be empowering and putting at the center of these solutions. So we need those voices to manifest themselves in terms of how these investments are landing or not landing at all. And we make that the point of departure on many of the peace-building funded initiatives. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks so much, Oscar. And I think your points actually also go to a question that Lauren Spink asked, which was how much were we able to kind of capture these more local dynamics, local governance, how resources end up really far downstream. And I think one of the challenges we had was we could use PBSO's tracking to capture kind of broad resource flows in general directions towards the state or not. But at that more granular level, I think there are still a lot of blind spots. And I know that PBSO has done a lot of work to try and create theories of change and explore how the impact is on the ground. But we found that there's still a lot of stuff we just don't know whether inclusion is landing on the ground. So it's really good to have examples and also to figure out where our blind spots might be. Ian, we've brought you in to pose your point. I think if you can turn your camera on, we will take it, and then I'll move on to some other questions that have started coming in.
Sure, thank you. I am not necessarily prepped for a presentation, as you could say, but just a quick observation. One of my hobby horses or bugbears, I guess, is our tendency in the peace building space to reinvent things that already exist elsewhere. And I'm struck in this conversation, I've worked in these issues for a number of years myself, that for a public choice theorist, what we're talking about, this kind of relationship between peace building practitioners, between a set of institutions and people in country and a set of interlocutors in government, is not surprising. You know, it's a situation of regulatory capture where you have a small group, very focused interests that has privileged access to a bureaucracy and obviously uses that access and pushes it in certain directions. And that's almost sort of arithmetically inevitable. You see it in agricultural policy, you see it in social protection, you see it in infrastructure spending. So it just prompts two questions for me. One, can we draw on that much broader literature and experience? The World Bank has decades of experience with environmental and social frameworks, which sort of forcibly redefine what success looks like and what metrics look like, and impose hard process requirements in the development of programs. That sort of has counterparts in the peace building space, but it's much newer, it's much smaller. The PBSO, I'm very conscious, has been doing this on specific issues around women's involvement, to some extent around the involvement of youth. Oscar was just giving a few more nuances on that. But can we draw on 50 years of experience in the development space in this regard, and longer in the social policy space in the rich world, as to how you structure the incentives of bureaucracies to avoid capture in that sense? And then a second comment, is this conversation impactful if it doesn't bring in other actors who don't identify as peace builders? So one of the problems you have when you look at this perspective for the World Bank, for example, is that the fraction of their portfolio that is identified as conflict mitigating is very small, and it's dwarfed in most cases by development programming, in many cases by a factor of 100 or more. So if you bring in conflict sensitivity, if you bring in inclusivity, if you bring in these sort of principles to the conflict mitigation part of the portfolio, does it matter? Does it meaningfully affect incentives if the vastly larger share of revenue that's going through central budgets is not really going to be in that conversation, because it's passing through different channels, it's subject to different constraints? I don't obviously have a clean answer to that. I just wanted to throw it on the table.
Great, thanks so much, Ian. I think that's a provocative point also, whether we can draw across these different fields. I'm aware that we are running rapidly out of time for our event, and there are still a lot of questions pending. Do any of our panelists want to react to any of them, or make any, I guess, slightly final points before we close this? Allegra, I see your hand up, so I'll call on you first. Please go ahead.
Well, okay, there was this one specific question, but I think there's the previous speaker and Iago. I mean, one point is on UN integrated planning, and I think that's the question. Can it be efficient? Can it really cover everyone? And the second question is, should these principles, be expanded and worked out for all parts of our work? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think from my perspective, the humanitarian, the human rights, I also should have mentioned, every family kind of needs to find its own principles, but then we need those overarching ones. And I think that speaks to the point of this question, which is then they need to lead our planning. And in every country, sometimes there'll be squabbles within the UN family, with every part wanting to say, well, me first, and please don't do that, because if you do that, I won't be able to do something else. And I think that's the conversation we need to enable. And as I said, there is a started conversation in the executive committee and deputy executive committee, but then we have to come out of that conversation with an agreement that says, right, in X country, our peace building goals will, trump some other goal. And I think that's where we don't then kind of fall into place. And so I think, Olivier, to your question, I think it absolutely can. UN integrated planning can work. And I think we've seen it work. We're just not applying it as systematically as we should. And maybe just because I have the floor, and so again, Iago's question, but also this question about, this comment, well, ultimately we're all government, so we are them. Which of course always comes back when you're in the field, as I said before, which master are you really serving? But to me, the way I've resolved it as RC is, yeah, absolutely, we're government, but we're also the government and the governments that agreed to the SDGs and to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to some of these very high value-based framework. So when I am in country, I am also fulfilling the vision of governments as they were signing. So I don't think the debate around values should be as hard as it is when you are in country. And I think we should really rethink this very quick way out that we always have is whatever government tells us to do. And it's not only in the UN, a lot of the bilaterals, we're here to, because down the line, and I think this has been a discussion, is let's look back at some of those countries we're in today and let's ask ourselves, where were we 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as we were enabling these visions, and look at where we are today. And I think Rachel spoke to, we need to really not be naive, very clear-eyed, make these decisions, but know that we'll be in these countries 20 years from now. And people will remember, who we stood with and what we stood for. So again, last point is really, let's look at this in the long term. Thank you.
That was a really good point. And I think the World Bank assessment that much of this transformational change takes more like 4 decades than 4 years really points to the inadequacy of our development funding cycles. And Rachel wrote a report, which I think I'm going to butcher the title, Plan for Sailboats, Not Train Tracks, which also points to the non-linearity of change in many of these settings. There's often feeling that you're falling back or having negative indicators and you're going the wrong direction, whereas if you take a longer view, you might actually see progress in a different way. Rachel, were there any final points that you wanted to make to any of we now have far too many questions to deal with in the chat, but any kind of final points you wanted to make before we start wrapping up?
I think the key point that a number of people made in the chat is that them is us, that as a body made up of member states, the UN has a real challenge in figuring out how to deal with the fact that a number of the states that are problematic are also going to be setting these agendas and determining how to get the process points Allegra's made the case for, or the practical tactics that Oscar is talking about through these member state bodies is a real challenge. I'm not a UN expert. I don't have the expertise to tell you how to do that, but I think it's that's going to be the challenge on the plate.
Thanks so much. I don't see any of the other panelists with their hands up. We're already 6 minutes over our allotted time. I mean, just for everyone who's joined this, we really don't have the answers to these questions. And I think one of the advantages of being an academic, and I remember this when I started a PhD program, my advisor said, you never have to answer any of the questions you pose, you just have to make them complicated enough. And I think one of the challenges that we've tried to address here is to pose the question in a way that's meaningful for policymakers and practitioners, so that there's a real life reality to these questions. And I think when you see someone like Allegra, who's actually been dealing with many of these questions in these regimes, you realize that there isn't a one size fits all. And what we'd love to do is oh, I see Alice with her hand raised. I'll give you the last word, Alice. But really, that what we're trying to do is provoke a discussion that highlights the problems rather than necessarily resolves them in a way that does lead to a change in activity. And I think there is a moment around the pandemic when you have these huge flows of resources to ask big questions about what it means to try to fix some of these systems, with heavy quotes around the fix. And I hope that this report contributes to that conversation. But Alice, you had the first word, and we're happy to give you the last one. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Adam. It was just a very brief, really, to respond to what others have said. And I say again, it's fantastic, rich discussion today, and I've really taken away a lot of points and recommendations from our panelists and actually from the chat bar as well. And particularly this sense of the long-term change, and really as a donor perspective, the need for us to have that sort of staying power and sort of risk tolerance on results, and something for us to really take away. And I think lots of a key theme around this is I think someone in the chat bar said peace building is political. And the more that we can do to support, as Rachel said, that building for the future and working with those communities and local level stakeholders to build that resilience in societies, the more they're in a better position to seize the opportunities when political change does come, and when there is political will for big change. So there are several recent examples, I think, in the field of that. So thank you very much again to all of you for joining. A fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all, and in particular to the panelists for their reflections on this, and to Alice, please pass our best to your government and thank you all for supporting us. And we hope to see you at the next one. But in the meantime, please do be in touch directly with us if you have any questions, and look forward to seeing all of you soon.